We're back. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is you're looking at this. Sorry for the delay in getting the video up. I had some computer difficulty. I'll make this one due on Tuesday, the 18th. Okay, so our aim is how did disagreements over taxation lead to the American Revolution? So we're starting to get into the Revolutionary period, and we have to understand how all of the seeds for colonial independence are actually going to turn into colonial independence. So our focus question today is how did the British policy of salutary neglect help lead to a growing sense of colonial independence? We'll get to salutary neglect in a couple of minutes, but I want you to keep that term in the back of your head as we go forward so you know when to listen to it. So let's dive right in. Okay. What we have to understand is that the North American colonies are going to be a flashpoint. Okay? We got to remember, we went back in period one, we talked about the competition that was existing between the different colonies, or between the different empires over the colonies in North America. So there was France, and there was Spain, and there was Great Britain. Well, by the 18th century, it's going to be Great Britain and France are going to be the two largest powers in Europe and in the world at that time. And they're going to be duking it out for supremacy. So what we're taking a look at is, this is what we call the 9 World Wars. So these great powers are fighting against each other for supremacy a number of times. And it's not just World War I and World War II, which are the big wars, but they're kind of seen in this succession of who are the great powers in Europe, who are the great powers of the world. And it starts way back in 1688 with the War of the League of Augsburg, and that's going to be dealing with Spain and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, and basically what we have are a number of wars that are going to be fought. In all of these wars, we're basically looking at who's going to be the top dog in Europe. Well, the one we're going to focus on right here is the 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763. It actually begins as the French and Indian War, and that begins in the Americas in 1754. That's a big one. The American Revolution is actually going to trigger a worldwide conflict, as well as the French Revolution, followed by the Napoleonic Wars, and then the 2 World Wars. So this is something that's going to be going on for quite a bit. So let's dive right in. Let's start talking about the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War is a bit of a misnomer. It's not going to be the French versus the Indians. It's going to be the British, and we got to remember the American colonies we're talking about are British colonies, against the French, who ally themselves with the Native Americans. So let me talk about the French a little bit in North America. The French are going to be up in Canada. Let me pull up a map. So let's take a look at a map of North America in 1754, just so we can get a sense. Let's see if I can make that bigger. Oh, I don't want that. Let's go back. Okay, well, this is kind of small, but you can kind of see it. Alright, so New France is this. Okay, it's the green. That's what France controlled. Their colonies were headquartered in Quebec, up in Canada, and also in Montreal. Then you have the 13 colonies down here. You also have British claims up here. You have New Spain, which extends all the way down to South America. Notice Florida is still part of Spain, and it will be for quite some time. And then you have uncharted territory out here, and then you even have Russian claims up here in the Pacific Northwest. So all of these different colonial empires are going to be in here. Now, the French are not going to develop their colonies the way the English did. Remember, there's going to be differences. In Spain, we're dealing with the encomienda system, the forced labor system, which then yields to slavery. Spain's going to be dealing with extracting resources. You know, working the local people to try to extract resources. We get a little bit of that in the southern colonies, how they develop slavery and go on the cash crop tobacco agricultural system based upon that. And that's mainly deal with climate. Spain pretty much deals with that system, and that's why we get all the different people that we have in Spain, because you know we're mainly working on a forced labor system with a very small population at top. In the English colonies, of course, we have the settlement of families, but also in the South we do have some forced labor. Mainly we're going to be talking about slavery after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. The French, however, are going to be fur traders. Okay? That's what you have to understand about the difference with the French. They're also not going to send over huge amounts of settlers the same way that the British did. But what they're going to do is they're going to be focused on the fur trading, especially beaver trading, and to a certain extent logging. Now, the French, because they were engaged with that level of activity, what they ended up doing was they made alliances with a lot of the Native American tribes. They did not get to the odd. They did not go at odds with the Native Americans the same way the British and the Spanish did. They weren't going in trying to claim the land and use the land. They didn't care if the natives were there. They only wanted to extract the wealth from the fur trading. And natives were actually allies in helping the French out with this. So the French actually developed very good relationships with the Native Americans, particularly the Hurons. And they're going to be they're going to be allied with the French going forward. So let's go back to our talking about this, and let's talk about the frontier land. Okay, the frontier land would be this area here. Okay, so we see this this beige area between the green and the purple. The purple is the British 13 colonies, and then we have New France. Well, this area is going to be kind of in dispute. It's in between both of the French claims and the British claims. So that's going to cause an issue. So the British colonies are starting to push west into the Ohio River Valley. That's the area in western Pennsylvania in what's now eastern Ohio to the south end of Lake Erie. So if we go back, it's this area right in here that's now Indiana, Ohio. They're starting to push into that area. They've started to push past the Appalachian Mountains, and we can actually see on this map, we have the river system. You got the Mississippi River and then the Ohio River in here. So this is going to be a very fertile area. It's going to be a very fertile plain. And the British settlers, of course, because they're always looking for more land, and people are coming over because that's the way of social mobility to move up. They want that land. So they start pushing in. And there's going to be a clash with the French settlements that are there. The governor of Virginia is going to send Lieutenant Colonel George Washington and 150 Virginia militiamen in 1754 to secure Virginian claims. Virginia is right down here. The state's borders were not set at that time. So basically, Virginians are going into the Ohio River Valley to try to claim some land for themselves. And they want to push in and basically expand their land holdings. Now, this is going to lead to a conflict, all right? And George Washington is actually going to get into a firefight with the French at Fort Donetsk. And this conflict is going to begin the French and Indian War. Okay, so we have shots fired between American colonists who are British citizens fighting against the French. And that's going to lead into an all-out war, which we call the French and Indian War. This is also going to be called the 7 Years' War, in Europe. It's the same war. It begins in the Americas, but it's going to spread and become a global conflict. Okay, and basically Britain is going to ally themselves with Prussia, who was the largest of the German states at the time, and then France, Austria, and Russia are going to ally together against them. Now, let's talk about it here. Here in the Americas, it is known as the French and Indian War because the French are allied with those Native American tribes. The British kind of have, as we've seen, the Native Americans are not going to like British settlers. They're not going to like the Americans. Why? Because Americans are taking native land. They keep pushing them off. Think about the Paxton Boys. Think about think about how the Powhatans were almost wiped out after a series of treaties with the Virginians. This is something that's been going on for a long time, and the natives do not trust the British settlers. They see the British settlers as coming in wanting to take their land. The French, on the other hand, are allies. They're working with the Native Americans. So that's why we call it the French and Indian War. Now, the conflict is going to get bigger, and it's going to be fought here in the Americas as well as going to be fought in Europe. Now, in 1754, the British government is going to call an Intercontinental Congress, and it's going to be at Albany, New York, which is the former Dutch settlement of Fort Orange. Albany is now the capital of New York State. So basically, 7 out of the 13 colonies are going to show up. The purpose was to try to keep the Iroquois Confederacy loyal to the British. The Iroquois controlled large swaths of New York, what is now New York State, into Pennsylvania. And they are really the gatekeepers. If the Iroquois had switched over to the French side, that would have made it incredibly difficult for the British to win, especially because if we go back to look at this map, New York is here, okay? Now, we have to think about it. Let's say the Iroquois had gone with the French. That would have given the French a foothold here, and basically New England would have been divided from Chesapeake. And once you have divided territory, it's much easier to conquer. So the Iroquois are going to be instrumental in the French and Indian War. So they wanted to keep them separate. Also, there was also the sense that, well, there are 13 British colonies by this time. And those colonies, basically, they need to create some kind of a unity between those colonies. Because if the colonies start going and doing their own thing and are not coordinated against the military of the French allied with the Native Americans, it's really going to be a problem. Benjamin Franklin, who was one of the representatives at the Albany Albany Conference, basically comes up with this Albany Plan of Union, and he is one of the big proponents of the different colonies joining in together. And he was actually a newspaper publisher, so this is one of his cartoons that he publishes. And we can see here we have New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, then Massachusetts, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and it's represented as a snake. And basically it says join or die. Basically the different parts of the snake are going to, they will all wither and die against the onslaught of the French unless they join together. Okay, so, but together they create something that is deadly, and then they can work to defend themselves. Okay, remember how I told you you were going to need a term? That term is going to be salutary neglect. Okay, so basically the British government kind of ignored the American colonies. Jamestown settled in 1607. We're talking about 150 years has passed by the time of the French and Indian War. And the colonies have basically been able to do what they wanted as long as revenue kept flowing into Great Britain. British did not really care. So 150 years pretty much of, you know, do as you please. So we got to think about that. This is going to be profound. 150 years. You know, 150 years ago, the Civil War had just ended. So, kind of put that into perspective. 150 years ago from 2016, the Civil War just ended. Think about that. This is a long time. This is a long period of history. Now, the British and the American colonists are going to end up beating the French at the French and Indian War. And basically, before this, the British government had the policy of salutary neglect. Let the colonies do as they will. But after the French and Indian War is over, the political game is going to change. Let's take a look at a map of North America. It's 1763. 1763 is the end of the French and Indian War. So let's take a look at a map. Okay, here's a map. Alright, so what do we notice how this map is different? Okay, if we take a look, we have the British basically conquer most of New France, with the Spanish taking over some, all the way up into Texas and part of Louisiana. And then we have some claims over here, that's Russian. Basically, the French were only left with their most profitable of colonies in the Americas, and that's going to be Haiti. Remember, those sugar colonies made the money. Okay, so the continental North American colonies the French had are basically going to be lost. They're going to get them back in the American Revolution, as we're going to see. So we have the original 13 colonies. Then we have all of this new land that has been basically taken by the British as a result of their victory. That's going to be important. Keep this map in mind. So, salutary neglect, the French and Indian War is over. So, French and Indian War begins on the American continent. The war was very costly for the British. Okay, basically it increased the British national debt from 74.6 million pounds in 1755 to 129.6 million pounds in 1764. It's a 50% increase in the national debt. Now, the British said because the French and Indian War is going to begin on the American continent, and because it was started by land-hungry American settlers, that, now granted, those Americans are British soldiers and are British citizens, and as such, Britain will oblige and protect British citizens with the French and Indian War, and they sent the British regulars out and they won the war. But they saw this debt part and parcel as an American responsibility. So the Americans were partially responsible for this war. They are partially responsible for this debt. They have to do their fair share in paying for this war that they just won. And basically that's going to lead to something called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is basically any goods that were sold, luxury goods, paper, letters, and things like that. They were basically attributed with a stamp from the British government, and that stamp basically you had to pay a tax for it. So they began regulating and putting taxes in place. Now, this is going to see the end of salutary neglect. Basically, the British are getting more and more involved in American affairs. Okay, the British are going to increase their following of a mercantilistic economic policy. We talked about mercantilism in the past. Mercantilism basically means that colonies exist to make money for the mother country. With the 7 Years' War, with the French and Indian War, the colonies are going to cost the British Empire money. So, therefore, the colonies have to pay for that money, Now, the colonies are going to be sources of raw materials and markets for finished goods. That's the definition of mercantilism. Okay, so the raw materials are going to be extracted out of the colonies. Finished goods from Britain are going to be sold in the colonies. They make money coming and going. Colonial manufacturing, therefore, is going to be cracked down on. They do not want the colonies to manufacture their own wares, which would then compete with British wares. plus the Stamp Act and Molasses Act, which is basically a tax on sugar, are going to be enforced. So if we take a look at this, this is the way the British saw it, okay? We want to make the money at the expense of the colonies, okay? We basically are going to build up our fleet. You don't have a fleet. We're going to take all of those natural resources, we're going to take all of the crops, and we're going to ship it off into Britain, where we're then going to turn it over into finished goods. The British colonies are going to, the British factories and the British manufacturing is going to boom, whereas American manufacturing isn't. Now, this is very good if you're living in Britain, but it's not very good if you're living in America. And in the Americas, the traders, the traders and the colonists, they basically had been left alone for a long time, and they were setting up a way to basically, make money on their own. And you have to remember that sense of social mobility. The average person in the colonies is going to be doing much better than the average person in Britain because of all of the economic opportunity. So the colonists really see this as something that's cutting into their way of life. They're not going to be able to make the money they were. And, it's the same way now is the same way it was then. You really want to get somebody mad, mess up with their money. Okay? Mess with their money. Mess with their ability to make money. That's going to get them angry. So, basically, the colonists are going to get extremely angry at these mercantilistic policies and the taxes. The taxes were very small in comparison to later taxes, but they're going to be very upset about the principle of the thing. Why do we have to pay these taxes when before we were not? And the colonists are going to get angry at the fact that they didn't have any say in the Parliament. The Parliament is going to be the British law-making body that basically passes laws and is going to be passing these taxes and these policies over on the colonies. Now, the colonists are going to be upset because they're going to say, we are British citizens. Now, because we are British citizens, we have the right to have our voice heard in government. But our voice is not being heard in government. These taxes and these policies are being passed to our detriment against our will, and we have no voice in it, which leads to the slogan, no taxation without representation. You need to etch this in your mind. It is going to be the cause of the American Revolution. No taxation without representation. Unless we have a say in the government that represents us, then how do you have the right to pass taxes and pass laws which hurt us? So, salutary neglect goes to no taxation without representation as a result of the 7 Years' War. Let's return to our focus question. How did the British policy of salutary neglect help lead to a growing sense of colonial independence? There's your focus question. There's your module. I hope you have a great day.